One trigger pull. That's all it would have taken. One squeeze of the finger and a young carjacker would have ended the life of a 70-year-old man on a peaceful Charleston street. But in the span of 3 heartbeats, everything changed. The elderly man moved with a speed that defied his age, his hands becoming weapons honed by decades of lethal training. His wife, a silver-haired woman clutching grocery bags, transformed into a tactical operator, her eyes scanning for threats with the cold precision of a seasoned killer. The street erupted into chaos, but not the kind anyone expected. This wasn't a random act of violence gone wrong. This was the unraveling of a 30-year secret, carefully maintained by 2 people who had sworn to leave their past behind. Margaret and Thomas Whitmore weren't just any retired couple enjoying their golden years in the American South. They were ghosts, operatives who had once hunted the most dangerous enemies of the British Crown in the shadows of the Cold War. They had killed, deceived, and sacrificed everything in the name of Queen and country. And when they finally walked away, they promised each other one thing: never again. But the past doesn't forget, and it certainly doesn't forgive. What started as a desperate criminal's mistake became the spark that ignited a war zone. Because when that security camera footage went viral, when those 3 seconds of impossible combat flashed across social media, someone was watching. Someone who remembered. Someone who had waited 30 years for revenge. And now, in the quiet streets of Charleston, South Carolina, 2 retired spies would face their most dangerous mission yet: survival. How did a simple carjacking turn into an international crisis? What secrets were Margaret and Thomas hiding? And who was coming for them? Stay with us, because what you're about to discover will leave you speechless. Charleston, South Carolina has a way of making people forget their troubles. The historic architecture, the warm coastal breeze, the pace of life that moves just slow enough to let you breathe. For Margaret and Thomas Whitmore, this city had become their sanctuary, a place where no one asked questions, where their British accents were charming rather than suspicious, where they could finally be just another elderly couple enjoying retirement. Their morning routine was sacred. Thomas woke at 6:15 exactly as he had for 47 years. Military precision never leaves you, even when you trade combat boots for slippers. He'd prepare tea, always Earl Grey, steeped for exactly 4 minutes. Margaret would join him at 6:30, her silver hair already perfectly styled, dressed in clothes that whispered elegance rather than shouted it. They'd sit on their porch, watching Charleston wake up, saying little, because they didn't need to say much. 30 years together, 23 of those married, had taught them the language of comfortable silence. "Beautiful morning," Thomas said, his British accent still crisp despite decades in America. His weathered hands wrapped around the teacup, and if you looked closely, you'd see the faint scars. Training accidents, he'd tell neighbors. No one needed to know about Moscow, about Berlin, about the night in Prague, when he'd fought 3 KGB agents with nothing but a broken bottle and sheer determination. Margaret smiled, her blue eyes scanning the street with a casualness that wasn't casual at all. Old habits die hard. She counted vehicles, noted faces, tracked patterns. The mailman arrived at 7:12, always. Mrs. Henderson walked her dog at 7:25. The college student 3 houses down left for class at 7:40. Routine meant safety. Deviation meant threat. "We need groceries," she said. "The market opens at 8. Thomas nodded. "I'll drive." They'd moved to Charleston in 1995, 3 months after their last mission. The official story was simple. Thomas had worked in international banking, Margaret in diplomatic services. Boring, forgettable, perfect. They'd bought a modest 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood, joined a book club, attended church occasionally. They were friendly but not close, polite but not invasive. The perfect cover isn't elaborate, it's ordinary. What their neighbors didn't know was that their basement contained a small arsenal, carefully maintained and completely illegal. Or that Margaret could field strip a Glock in 14 seconds blindfolded. Or that Thomas had once been considered one of MI6's most effective interrogators. These were details that belonged to Margaret Pemberton and Thomas Whitmore of London, operational designation Nightingale and Bishop. Not to the Whitmores of Charleston, who grew tomatoes and complained about property taxes. The Harris Teeter grocery store was quiet at 8:15 on a Thursday morning. Mostly retirees and young mothers, people moving through aisles with the unhurried pace of those who had nowhere pressing to be. Margaret selected vegetables with the same attention she'd once given to surveillance equipment. Thomas pushed the cart, occasionally adding items with the confidence of a man who'd learned to cook out of necessity during lengthy stakeouts. They didn't notice the young man watching them from the parking lot. Why would they? They'd been careful for so long, maintained their cover so perfectly, that the idea of being compromised seemed impossible. This was their mistake. Not a big one, but in their former profession, small mistakes had a way of becoming fatal. Deshaun Carter was 22 years old, and his life had become a series of catastrophically bad decisions. The latest was owing $5,000 to a dealer named Tremaine, a man whose patience had run out 3 days ago. The warning had been clear: pay up by Friday or face consequences that would make death seem like mercy. Deshaun had no $5,000, he barely had 50, but he had desperation, a .38 revolver his cousin had sold him, and a growing sense that he was out of options. When he saw the elderly couple loading groceries into a pristine 2018 Honda Accord, something clicked in his mind. Old people, probably had cash, definitely couldn't fight back. Easy target. He'd take the money, maybe the car, be done in 2 minutes. It seemed simple. Deshaun approached as Thomas was closing the trunk, Margaret already seated in the passenger side. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline making his hands shake as he pulled the revolver from his waistband. "Don't move, old man," Deshaun said, his voice cracking slightly. "Wallet, keys, now." Thomas turned slowly, his expression mild, almost grandfatherly. His eyes found the gun, assessed it in a microsecond. Revolver, probably loaded, amateur grip, finger on trigger, high-stress hold. The boy was terrified, which made him dangerous. "Son, you don't want to do this," Thomas said calmly. "Put the gun down and we'll forget this happened." "Shut up!" Deshaun's voice rose. "Wallet! Now!" Inside the car, Margaret's hand moved to her purse, fingers finding the familiar shape of the ceramic knife she always carried. Ceramic because it didn't set off metal detectors, small because it was easy to conceal, deadly because she'd spent years learning exactly where to place it. She watched through the side mirror, calculating angles, distance, timing. Thomas raised his hand slowly, unthreatening. "It's okay. My wallet is in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for it now, nice and slow." But he didn't reach for his wallet. He'd already run the scenario a dozen times in his head, muscle memory from 1,000 training sessions taking over. The threat assessment was complete, amateur, scared, telegraphing every intention, survivable. Thomas moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a 70-year-old man. His left hand swept up and across, deflecting the gun away from his body, while his right hand locked onto Deshaun's wrist. The Krav Maga technique was flawless, executed with the precision of someone who'd done it in real life, when bullets were actual and death was certain. He twisted, rotated his hip, and suddenly Deshaun was face down on the asphalt, his arm locked in a position that sent lightning bolts of pain through his shoulder. The revolver clattered to the ground. Margaret was already out of the car, her body language transformed. The sweet old lady was gone, replaced by something cold and efficient. She kicked the gun away, positioning herself to shield Thomas's blind spot, her eyes scanning for additional threats. "Stay down," Thomas said quietly, his knee pressed into Deshaun's back. "Don't fight. You'll only hurt yourself worse." Deshaun gasped, confusion and terror flooding his mind. What the hell just happened? 1 second he had a gun on an old man, the next he was eating pavement, his arm feeling like it might snap off. "Who are you people?" "No one special," Margaret said, her British accent suddenly sharper, more authoritative. "Just two people who don't appreciate being threatened." A woman screamed from across the parking lot. Others started pulling out phones. Thomas could already hear sirens in the distance. Someone had called the police. This was about to become complicated. "Margaret," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "We need to control the narrative." By the time the Charleston police arrived 4 minutes later, the scene had been carefully staged. Thomas was sitting on the curb, looking shaken but brave. Margaret was comforting a crying mother whose child had witnessed the incident. Deshawn was conscious but dazed, handcuffed by his own belt, the gun secured in a grocery bag. Just two lucky seniors who'd managed to defend themselves against a desperate criminal. Nothing more. Officer Sarah Jenkins took their statements, impressed by their calm demeanor and clear recollection of events. "You folks did everything right," she said. "Must have been terrifying." "Quite," Thomas said with a weak smile. "Adrenaline is an extraordinary thing." What Officer Jenkins didn't notice was the micro-expressions Margaret and Thomas exchanged, the silent conversation that said, "This is a problem. We've been exposed. We need to assess the damage." As they drove home, Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from a number she hadn't seen in 15 years. A number that should have been deactivated, erased, forgotten. Just 2 words. "Saw you." Thomas glanced at the screen. His jaw tightened. "Who?" "I don't know," Margaret said quietly. "But they're from the old life." The past, it seemed, had finally caught up with them. If you want to know what happens next, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that like button, leave a comment below, and share this video with anyone who loves stories that'll leave them on the edge of their seat. Because what's coming next will shock you. Trust me, you don't want to miss what this mysterious message means for Margaret and Thomas. The real danger is just beginning. The video appeared online 6 hours after the incident. Someone's phone camera had captured the entire confrontation from across the parking lot. 37 seconds of footage that showed Thomas moving with combat-trained precision, Margaret adopting a tactical stance that looked ripped from a military training manual, and Deshawn hitting the ground before he understood what happened. It was uploaded to Reddit first, then Twitter, then TikTok. By evening, it had 3 million views. The comments section exploded. "Those aren't normal grandparents. Look at that disarm technique, that's military grade. The way she positions herself as backup, that's operator-level training. Who are these people?" Local news picked it up by the 10 o'clock broadcast. "Elderly British couple thwarts armed robbery with impressive self-defense skills," read the headline on WCSC News 5. The anchor interviewed witness Patricia Monroe, who couldn't stop talking about how, like something from a movie, it all was. The story was perfect for the news cycle. Feel-good, surprising, shareable. Margaret watched the broadcast from their living room, her face expressionless. Thomas stood by the window, his eyes tracking every vehicle that passed their house. They'd been through situations like this before, moments when their cover threatened to crack. The protocol was clear: assess, adapt, disappear if necessary. "It's just local news," Thomas said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "It'll blow over in 48 hours. People have short attention spans." "That text message," Margaret replied. "Someone from our past saw this, which means others might see it too." Thomas turned to face her. "How many people would even remember us? It's been 30 years, love. Most of our old contacts are dead, retired, or suffering from dementia." "Not all of them." The name hung unspoken between them. Viktor Sokolov. The one loose end they'd never been able to tie up. The one enemy who'd sworn vengeance before disappearing into the chaos of the Soviet collapse. They'd assumed he was dead, arrested, or irrelevant. But assumptions in their line of work were dangerous. Margaret's phone buzzed again, another text from the same unknown number. "Victor says hello." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thomas's expression hardened into something dangerous, something that hadn't shown itself in decades. "That's impossible. Victor was flagged by Interpol in 1996. He should be in prison or dead." "Should be," Margaret echoed. "But intelligence suggests otherwise." She opened her laptop, fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced speed. Her access to MI6 databases had been revoked upon retirement, but she'd maintained other channels: encrypted networks, hacker forums, information brokers who owed her favors. Within 15 minutes, she'd pulled up surveillance reports, Interpol bulletins, and fragmented intelligence from agencies across 3 continents. Viktor Sokolov had indeed disappeared in 1996, but not into prison. He'd gone underground, used his KGB training to build a new identity, and eventually surfaced in the United States under the name Victor Sullivan. He ran a security consulting firm in Atlanta, Georgia, just 4 hours north of Charleston, Legitimate on the surface, but with connections to Russian organized crime that intelligence agencies suspected but couldn't prove. "He's been here the whole time," Thomas said quietly. 4 hours away. And now he knows where we are. The implications were staggering. Victor wasn't just some grudge-holding ex-spy. He was connected, resourced, and patient. The kind of enemy who'd wait 30 years for the perfect moment to strike. And that video, that damned viral video, had given him exactly what he needed. Thomas moved to the basement, Margaret following close behind. The space looked like any other suburban storage area. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old furniture, gardening tools. But Thomas pressed a specific sequence on the electrical panel, and a section of the wall clicked open. Behind it was a narrow room, maybe 6 feet by 10, containing everything they'd hoped never to use again. Weapons, 2 Glock 19s, a Sig Sauer P226, a disassembled Remington 700 sniper rifle. Ammunition, enough for a small war. Communication devices, encrypted phones, a satellite uplink, frequency scramblers. Documents, passports under 6 different names, currency in dollars, euros, and pounds. Credit cards tied to shell corporations. And in a locked drawer, something Margaret hadn't touched in 3 decades, her MI6 identification badge frozen in time, showing a younger woman with hard eyes and no illusions. "We could run," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Disappear like we planned, Argentina, New Zealand, somewhere remote." Margaret checked the magazine on one of the Glocks, ejected it, reseated it with a satisfying click. "And let Victor think he won? Let him believe he chased us into hiding? Pride is a dangerous thing, Margaret. So is leaving threats unresolved." They stood in silence, 2 people weighing options, calculating probabilities. Running meant abandoning everything they'd built. Fighting meant risking exposure, arrest, or death. But there was a third option, one they'd used before in Moscow and Damascus. Control the board, dictate the terms, turn the hunter into the hunted. Margaret's phone rang. Not the encrypted one from the basement, but her regular iPhone. The caller ID said, "Unknown." She answered on speaker. "Mrs. Whitmore," the voice was accented Russian, smooth as poisoned honey. "Or should I say Agent Nightingale?" "Who is this?" Margaret's voice was steady, giving nothing away. "You don't remember, I'm hurt. Berlin, 1989. You and your partner destroyed my career, cost me everything. I spent 5 years in a Siberian prison because of you. 5 years thinking about what I'd do if I ever saw you again." Thomas leaned closer to the phone. "Victor." "Bishop. Still alive, I see. Good. I'd hate for this reunion to be incomplete." "What do you want?" Margaret asked. "Want?" Victor laughed, a sound without humor. "I want to watch you suffer. I want to take everything from you, the way you took everything from me. Your peace, your safety, your pathetic little retirement fantasy. I'm going to burn it all down." "You could try," Thomas said calmly. "Others have." "Others weren't me. Others didn't spend 3 decades planning, building resources, waiting for the perfect moment. That video was a gift, my friends. A spotlight on 2 ghosts who thought they could hide. Now everyone's watching, and I'm going to put on such a show." The line went dead. Margaret and Thomas exchanged a look, years of partnership condensed into a single moment of understanding. This wasn't a bluff. Victor was coming, and he was coming with everything he had. "We need backup," Margaret said. "Who?" "We've been dark for 30 years. MI6 won't help us, not officially. CIA doesn't even know we exist. We're on our own. Then we use what we have. This house, our skills, and the element of surprise." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Surprise? He knows exactly where we are. He knows where we live. He doesn't know what we're capable of, not really. He remembers us from 30 years ago when we were younger, slower. He's expecting the couple from that video. We give him something else entirely." Over the next 6 hours, Margaret and Thomas transformed their home into a tactical fortress. Pressure sensors under the welcome mat, motion detectors in the garden, cameras with facial recognition software monitoring every approach. They moved furniture to create cover positions, established fallback points, pre-staged weapons in strategic locations. The living room became a kill box, the kitchen an armored position, The upstairs a final redoubt if everything went wrong. Neighbors noticed the activity, of course. Mrs. Henderson asked if they were doing renovations. Thomas smiled and said they were upgrading their security system after the incident. "Can't be too careful these days," he'd said with a grandfatherly chuckle. She'd nodded sympathetically and gone back to her dog walking. By midnight, the house was ready. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, cleaning weapons with the meditative focus of a ritual. Thomas monitored the security feeds from his laptop, watching the street, tracking patterns, looking for anomalies. "He won't come himself," Margaret said quietly. "Not at first. He'll send contractors, test our defenses, probe for weaknesses." "Agreed. The question is when." The answer came at 2:17 in the morning. The motion sensor on the eastern perimeter triggered first, then the thermal camera picked up 3 heat signatures approaching from the back fence. Professional spacing, tactical movement, suppressed weapons visible in their hands. Not amateurs, not even close. Thomas switched off the house lights, activating night vision mode on the internal cameras. 3 targets approaching from the rear, they're good. Margaret moved to her position on the second floor, the reassembled Remington rifle comfortable in her hands despite the years. Through the scope's night vision, she could see them clearly. Ex-military, probably Spetsnaz given Victor's connections. Body armor, communications gear, coordinated movement. They expected an easy kill, 2 old people asleep in bed. They were about to learn a very painful lesson. What's your take on this so far? Are Margaret and Thomas making the right choice, or should they have run? Drop your thoughts in the comments and stick around, because the battle that's about to erupt in that quiet Charleston neighborhood will leave you absolutely stunned. The first mercenary reached the back door at 2:19. He examined the lock with practiced efficiency, producing a specialized tool that should have bypassed the mechanism in seconds. What he didn't know was that Margaret had rigged the door with a pressure release trap, a technique she'd learned from a Mossad operative in Tel Aviv back in 1987. The moment he applied torque to the lock, a canister of CS tear gas exploded directly into his face. The man stumbled backward, gasping, his night vision goggles useless, his eyes and lungs burning with chemical fire. His partners moved to assist, breaking their tactical formation, creating exactly the opening Margaret needed. The Remington 700 coughed once, a suppressed round that sounded like a book dropping on a hardwood floor. The second mercenary went down, a non-lethal shot to his thigh that shattered his femur and took him out of the fight. Margaret didn't want to kill unless absolutely necessary. Bodies meant investigations, investigations meant exposure. Thomas was already moving through the house, a Glock in one hand, a tactical flashlight in the other. The third mercenary made it through the window on the eastern side, glass shattering into the living room, but he landed directly on a pressure plate that triggered a flashbang grenade Margaret had positioned earlier. The explosion of light and sound disoriented him completely, and Thomas was on him in seconds, using a rear chokehold that cut off blood flow to the brain without crushing the windpipe. The man went limp in 11 seconds. Outside, the first mercenary was still gasping, tears streaming down his face, vomiting from the gas exposure. Margaret descended the stairs calmly, zip-tying the unconscious intruder in the living room before moving to secure the others. Within 5 minutes, all 3 men were neutralized, conscious but helpless, arranged in a neat row in the Whitmore's garage. Thomas stood over them, his expression cold. "Who sent you?" The men said nothing. Professional courtesy among mercenaries. You don't give up your employer. But Margaret had dealt with professional courtesy before. She knelt beside the man with the shattered femur, her voice soft, almost kind. "That's a compound fracture," she said. "Very painful. If you don't receive proper medical attention in the next hour, you risk permanent nerve damage, possible amputation. Your partners here are fine, just humiliated. But you're facing a life-changing injury." She paused, letting that sink in. "Or I can call an ambulance right now. Get you to MUSC Hospital, where talented surgeons will save your leg. All you have to do is confirm what we already know. Victor sent you." The man's face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. Pain and pragmatism battled in his expression. Finally, he nodded. "Victor Sullivan. $5,000 per man, plus bonuses if we brought proof of death." How many more is he sending? This was the probe. If we didn't report back by 3 a.m., he'd assume we failed and escalate. Thomas checked his watch. 2:43. Define escalate. Bigger team, heavy weapons. He's not playing games anymore. Margaret stood, pulling out her phone. She dialed 911, reported a break-in, described 3 injured intruders who'd been incapacitated by homeowners in self-defense. The dispatcher's voice was professionally calm, promising units in 5 minutes. Margaret hung up and looked at Thomas. We can't stay here. The police will have questions, the media will return, and Victor will just keep sending people until we're either dead or imprisoned for excessive force. Where do we go? Offensive position, we've been reacting, time to act. But before they could finalize plans, Margaret's encrypted phone buzzed. A text from yet another unknown number. Nightingale, this is Falcon. Heard you're having trouble. Check your email, secure protocol 7. Falcon. The designation made Margaret's pulse quicken. Commander James Rutherford, her old handler at MI6. A man she'd assumed was either retired or dead. Protocol 7 meant an encryption key from 1993, a system so old it had been abandoned by modern intelligence services, which made it paradoxically secure. She opened her laptop, navigated to a webmail service she hadn't accessed in 15 years, entered credentials from muscle memory. One new message, sender anonymous, encrypted with Protocol 7. She decrypted it quickly. The message was brief. Victor Sokolov-Kosullivan is on multiple watch lists. If you need assistance neutralizing him, off-book resources are available. Not official, not sanctioned, but available. Friends don't forget. Falcon. An address in Atlanta followed, along with a contact protocol. Thomas read over her shoulder, then met her eyes. It's a trap, maybe. Or maybe Falcon remembers what we did for him in Budapest. That was 32 years ago. Some debts don't expire. Police sirens were getting closer. They had perhaps 90 seconds before officers arrived. Margaret made a decision, the kind of instinctive call that had kept her alive through 20 years of operations. We go to Atlanta. We find Victor. We end this. And if Falcon's compromised, then we improvise, same as always. Officer Jenkins arrived with 3 other units, finding a scene that looked like a textbook home invasion defense. 3 injured men, 1 with a broken leg, all wearing tactical gear, weapons scattered around the property. Margaret and Thomas, shaken but unharmed, giving statements that were technically true but strategically incomplete. Yes, they'd defended their home. Yes, they'd had security measures in place after the earlier incident. No, they had no idea who these men were or why they'd been targeted. The lead detective, Marcus Washington, was thorough but sympathetic. You folks have had one hell of a week. First the carjacking, now this. You have any enemies we should know about? Thomas shook his head. We're retired, detective. We live quiet lives. This is as much a mystery to us as it is to you. It wasn't a lie, technically. Victor was an enemy from a life that officially didn't exist. Detective Washington couldn't help with ghosts. By 4:30 a.m., the police had finished their initial investigation. The 3 mercenaries were being transported to the hospital under guard, facing charges of breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, and conspiracy. They'd lawyer up, refuse to talk, and eventually be deported or imprisoned. Victor would be insulated from direct connection. Margaret and Thomas packed quickly once the police left. 2 go-bags they'd maintained for decades, containing clothes, documents, cash, and weapons. They left a note for Mrs. Henderson, claiming they needed to visit family in Atlanta for a few weeks. By 5:15 they were on Interstate 26, heading northwest toward Atlanta, toward Victor, toward a confrontation 30 years in the making. The drive took 4 hours, dawn breaking over the South Carolina countryside as they traveled. They didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say. Both understood the risks. Victor was connected, resourced, and operating on home territory. This could easily become a suicide mission. But they'd survived worse odds. Belgrade in 1991, Cairo in 1993, that nightmare week in Sarajevo during the siege. They'd lived through impossibilities by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than their enemies. Age had slowed them, but it had also given them something younger operatives lacked: patience, perspective, and the cold certainty that comes from knowing you've already survived your share of near-death experiences. Atlanta's skyline appeared on the horizon at 9:43. Margaret pulled up the address Falcon had provided. A warehouse in the industrial district near Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, the kind of place that attracted no attention, where trucks came and went at all hours, where people minded their own business. They parked 2 blocks away, approaching on foot. Thomas carried a concealed Glock, Margaret a ceramic knife, and a small .380 backup piece. The warehouse looked abandoned, rust stains streaking the corrugated metal walls, windows dark and empty. "I don't like this," Thomas muttered. "Too quiet." "Agreed, but we're out of options." They entered through a side door, finding themselves in a vast, empty space filled with shadows and the smell of old motor oil. Then lights flickered on, revealing not an ambush but a single figure standing in the center of the warehouse. Commander James Rutherford looked older than Margaret remembered, his hair white instead of grey, his face lined with 70 years of hard living. But his eyes were sharp and his stance was that of a man who could still handle himself in a fight. "Nightingale Bishop." His British accent was crisp, formal. "It's been too long." "Falcon," Margaret replied carefully. "We weren't sure you'd be alone." "I am. This isn't an official operation. If it were, we wouldn't be meeting in an abandoned warehouse." He gestured to a table where files and photographs were spread out. "Viktor Sokolov has been on our radar for years, but we can't touch him officially. He's got diplomatic immunity through technicalities, connections to Russian intelligence that make him untouchable, and lawyers who can tie up any prosecution for decades." "So why contact us?" Thomas asked. Rutherford smiled grimly. "Because you're not bound by the same rules. You're ghosts, remember. Officially, you don't exist, which means if Victor were to suffer an unfortunate accident, no one could connect it to MI6, the Crown, or anyone else. You want us to assassinate him," Margaret said flatly. "I want you to survive. If Victor happens to not survive the encounter, well, that's just unfortunate." Rutherford tapped one of the files. "He's planning something big for tonight. A direct strike on you, using a team of 12 former Spetsnaz operators. Heavy weapons, no subtlety. He wants you dead and he wants it public. A message to anyone who thinks they can cross him and live." Margaret studied the intelligence reports. Times, locations, resources. Victor would hit at 8 p.m. at a hotel he'd tracked them to, except they weren't at any hotel. "He doesn't know we're here," she said slowly. "No, he's operating on surveillance from Charleston, tracking your credit cards, phone signals. He thinks you're still scrambling, scared, vulnerable." Thomas and Margaret exchanged a look, the same thought occurring to both simultaneously. If Victor expected them to be on the defensive, cowering and afraid, what if they reversed it? What if they hit him first? "Where does Victor live?" Margaret asked. Rutherford hesitated, then slid another file across the table. "That's extremely dangerous. He's got security, countermeasures, panic rooms. It's not a place you assault lightly." "We're not assaulting anything," Margaret said. "We're paying a visit. One old enemy to another. Sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun, it's a conversation. I want to take a moment to thank you sincerely for sticking with this story. We're past the halfway point and the intensity is only going to increase. The best is yet to come, trust me. What happens when 2 legendary spies walk directly into their enemy's stronghold? Stay tuned because the next chapter will take your breath away." Victor Sullivan's estate sat on 5 acres in an exclusive Atlanta suburb, protected by walls, cameras, and a security team that rotated in 8-hour shifts. The house itself was modern architecture, all glass and steel and deliberate intimidation. It screamed money, power, and danger, exactly what you'd expect from a former KGB colonel who'd reinvented himself as a security consultant to oligarchs and criminals. Margaret and Thomas observed the property from a rented office building 3 blocks away, using a spotting scope and Rutherford's intelligence files. They'd been watching for 6 hours, learning patterns, identifying weaknesses. The security was good, professional, but it was designed to repel frontal assaults and surveillance teams. It wasn't designed for 2 people who'd spent decades learning to become invisible. 4 guards on rotation, Thomas noted. Dogs patrol the perimeter at irregular intervals. Cameras cover every approach except the northwest corner, where the trees create a blind spot for approximately 45 seconds. Pressure sensors? Likely, but Falcon's intelligence suggests they're calibrated for heavier weight. We keep to the grass, distribute our weight. We might avoid triggering them. Margaret checked her watch. 6:15 p.m. Victor would be preparing for his 8 o'clock strike, confident that his enemies were miles away, frightened and vulnerable. His arrogance would be his weakness. "How do you want to play this?" Thomas asked. "Quiet infiltration or walk straight through the front door?" Margaret smiled slightly. "Neither. We call ahead." She pulled out a burner phone Rutherford had provided, dialed the number from Victor's business card that Falcon had included in the intelligence package. It rang twice before a woman's voice answered in Russian-accented English. "Sullivan Security Consulting. This is Margaret Whitmore, formerly MI6 designation Nightingale. I need to speak with Viktor Sokolov immediately. Tell him I'm calling to arrange a meeting. Tonight. Just him and me." There was a long pause. Then, "Hold, please." 30 seconds passed. Then Victor's voice, smooth and mocking. "Calling to surrender? How disappointing. Calling to negotiate. You want revenge for Berlin, I understand that. But sending waves of mercenaries to accomplish what you're too afraid to do yourself? That's beneath you, Victor. You were a colonel in the KGB, a legend in your own right. Don't you want to look me in the eye when you take your revenge?" She could practically hear him thinking, ego and caution warring in his mind. "You expect me to believe you'd walk into my home alone?" "Not alone, my husband will accompany me. No weapons, no backup, no tricks. Just 2 old spies and 1 older spy, settling accounts the old-fashioned way. Conversation first. If you still want us dead after that, then at least you'll have earned it face to face." Another pause. "Why would you do this?" "Because I'm tired of running. Because you're right. We did destroy your career, and you deserve to hear why. And because if we're going to die, I'd rather it be with some dignity than being gunned down in a hotel room by men who don't even know our names." It was a gamble, appealing to Victor's ego and his sense of old-world professionalism. The KGB had been brutal, but it had also been governed by codes, rituals, hierarchies of respect. If Victor was truly a man of that system, he'd recognize the courage in what Margaret was proposing. 7 p.m., Victor said finally. "You walk through my front gate. My security will scan you for weapons. Any deviation from what you've promised, and you'll never leave my property alive." "Understood." The line went dead. Thomas looked at her incredulously. "Are you insane? We're walking into a death trap with no weapons and no backup plan." "We have the best weapon, his curiosity. Victor's been waiting 30 years for this moment. He won't kill us immediately. He'll want to savor it, explain himself, justify everything. That's when we strike." "With what? Our charming personalities?" Margaret reached into her bag, pulling out 2 items Rutherford had provided. The first was a pen, innocuous-looking except for the small button on its side. "GPS tracker and emergency beacon. If we trigger this, Falcon has assets that can respond in 12 minutes. 12 minutes is an eternity in a gunfight, which is why we also have this." She held up what looked like an ordinary watch. "EMP device, one-time use, effective radius of 30 meters. It'll kill all electronics, including cameras, alarms, and communications. Gives us approximately 90 seconds of complete chaos before backup systems activate." Thomas took the items, understanding dawning. "We're not there to negotiate. We're there to end this." "Exactly. Victor thinks we're beaten, desperate. He's expecting us to beg, maybe cry, certainly show fear. Instead, we remind him why we were the ones who walked out of Berlin while he ended up in Siberia." They arrived at Victor's estate at 6:58 p.m., driving Thomas's Honda directly to the front gate. 2 security guards approached, professional and cold. They confiscated Margaret's purse, Thomas's wallet, conducted thorough pat-downs that found nothing because there was nothing to find. The watch and pen passed inspection as innocuous personal items. The gate opened, revealing a long driveway lined with lights that led to the main house. As they walked, Margaret counted at least 6 camera positions, probably motion sensors in the grass, and undoubtedly armed personnel watching from concealed positions. Victor was taking no chances. The front door opened before they reached it. Viktor Sokolov stood framed in the entrance, and Margaret felt a strange jolt of recognition. He'd aged, certainly. His hair was white, his face more lined, but his eyes held the same cold intelligence she remembered from Berlin. He wore an expensive suit, no tie, projecting casual authority. "Nightingale, Bishop, how kind of you to accept my invitation." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Please, come in. We have much to discuss." The interior of the house was exactly what Margaret expected. Expensive, impersonal, designed to impress rather than comfort. Victor led them to a sitting room, dominated by a massive window overlooking the property. 3 guards stood at strategic positions, weapons visible but not drawn. Professional courtesy among professionals. "Drink," Victor offered, moving to a bar. "I have excellent vodka, or perhaps whiskey for my British guests." "No, thank you," Margaret said, taking a seat on a leather couch that gave her sightlines to all 3 guards. Thomas remained standing, positioning himself where he could reach 2 of them, if necessary. Victor poured himself a vodka, neat, and settled into a chair across from them. 30 years. Can you believe it? 3 decades I've thought about this moment. What I'd say, what I'd do, how I'd make you suffer. And yet here we are, having a civilized conversation, Margaret replied. Perhaps we've all grown too old for the violence of our youth. Victor laughed, a harsh sound. Grown old? Yes. Too old for violence? I doubt that. You proved it quite effectively with my team last night. Very impressive, incidentally. 3 Spetsnaz veterans taken down by 2 pensioners. I underestimated you. You always did, Thomas said quietly. Berlin, 1989. You assumed we were just field agents, disposable assets. You never realized we were running the entire operation. Victor's expression darkened. You destroyed a network that took me years to build. Cost me my career, my freedom, 5 years of my life in a frozen hell. And for what? Cold War politics that meant nothing once the wall fell? It meant something then, Margaret said. That network was trafficking weapons-grade plutonium to terrorist organizations. We stopped it. Hundreds, maybe thousands of lives were saved. Saved. Victor spat the word. You speak of saving lives while destroying mine. The hypocrisy is remarkable. We did our jobs, Thomas said, same as you did yours. The difference is we were on the right side of history. The right side? Victor stood abruptly, his control slipping. There are no right sides, only winners and losers, and you made me a loser. You took everything from me. Margaret remained seated, her voice calm. So what now, Victor? You kill us? How does that help? We're already old, already at the end of our lives. You'd be killing ghosts. Exactly. Ghosts that have haunted me for 30 years. Once you're gone, I can finally be free. Will you? Margaret stood slowly, carefully. Or will you just be a bitter old man who wasted 3 decades nursing a grudge instead of building a new life? Look at yourself, Victor. You're successful, wealthy, powerful. You won. But you can't see it because you're still that colonel being dragged away in handcuffs. For a moment, something flickered in Victor's eyes. Doubt? Regret? It was hard to tell. Then his face hardened again, the moment passing. Touching speech, but it changes nothing. You both die tonight. The only question is whether it's quick, or whether I indulge my more creative impulses. Thomas tensed, calculating angles and distances. Margaret's hand moved subtly toward the watch on her wrist. This was the moment, the tipping point, where conversation ended and survival began. But before anyone could move, an alarm shrieked through the house. Not the intruder alarm, this was different, more urgent. One of the guards spoke into his radio, listened, then turned to Victor with barely concealed shock. Sir, we have multiple federal vehicles approaching. FBI by the look of it. They're surrounding the property. Victor's face went white. He spun toward Margaret and Thomas. What did you do? Margaret smiled thinly. We did nothing, but I suspect Commander Rutherford made some calls. Victor, you've been operating under diplomatic immunity and legal protection for years, but if the FBI has enough evidence to move on you, those protections mean nothing. You betrayed me. Victor's rage was incandescent. He gestured to the guards. Kill them, now. But Margaret had already triggered the EMP device on her watch. Every light in the house died. Cameras went dark. Communications went silent. In the sudden chaos and darkness, Margaret and Thomas moved with the precision of a synchronized dance they'd performed 100 times before. Thomas hit the nearest guard with a devastating elbow strike, using the man's own body as a shield against the second guard's gunfire. Margaret swept Victor's legs out from under him, using his momentum to slam him face first into the expensive hardwood floor. The third guard got off 2 shots before Thomas disarmed him, with a wrist lock that audibly cracked bone. 90 seconds. That's all they had before backup systems activated. Margaret grabbed Victor by the collar, hauling him toward the front door. "Move! FBI will protect you from us, but they'll also arrest you. Your choice. Face American justice or Russian retribution when your partners realize you're compromised." They burst through the front door just as floodlights from FBI vehicles illuminated the entire property. Agents in tactical gear swarmed the grounds, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Margaret and Thomas dropped to their knees, hands raised, as federal agents surrounded them. The special agent in charge, a woman named Patricia Chen, approached with a warrant in hand. "Victor Sullivan, also known as Victor Sokolov, you're under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. You have the right to remain silent." Margaret and Thomas were detained separately, questioned for 6 hours before Commander Rutherford appeared, with lawyers and documentation that cleared them of any wrongdoing. They'd been cooperating with an ongoing investigation, he explained. Their actions tonight had been instrumental in finally building a case against Sullivan. It was all theater, all carefully constructed narrative, but it worked. By dawn they were released, watching from a coffee shop across the street as Victor was led away in handcuffs, his empire crumbling, his revenge fantasies ending, not with violence, but with bureaucratic inevitability. "Think it'll stick?" Thomas asked, sipping terrible coffee. "The charges?" "Probably not all of them," Margaret admitted, "but enough. Victor will be tied up in legal proceedings for years. By the time he's out, if he gets out, he'll be too old to care about revenge. And if he's not, then we'll deal with it, same as always." They sat in companionable silence as the sun rose over Atlanta, 2 survivors of a war most people didn't know had been fought, enjoying a peace they'd earned through decades of sacrifice. The story is almost at its end, but the final chapter holds the resolution you've been waiting for. Don't leave now, we're about to bring this journey home. If you've made it this far, you're clearly invested in Margaret and Thomas's story, so make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that like button. The best stories are meant to be shared, and there are more incredible tales coming your way. Stay with us through the conclusion. You won't regret it. Charleston welcomed them back like old friends. The city hadn't changed in the week they'd been gone, but Margaret and Thomas had. There's something about facing your past, about settling old debts, that changes you on a fundamental level. They weren't younger, weren't stronger, but they were finally truly free. Mrs. Henderson greeted them with her usual cheerful nosiness as they pulled into the driveway. "Oh, you're back. How was Atlanta? Everything all right with your family?" "Everything's perfect now," Margaret replied with genuine warmth. "Thank you for watching the house." The interior of their home still bore signs of the confrontation, bullet holes patched but visible, new locks on doors and windows, security systems upgraded. But underneath it all, it was still home. The place where they'd built a life separate from Nightingale and Bishop, separate from MI6 and the Cold War, and everything they'd left behind. Or so they'd hoped. 3 days after their return, Margaret received an email from Commander Rutherford, brief, encrypted, and troubling. "Victor made bail. Oligarch connections pulled strings. He's free pending trial. Thought you should know. Falcon." Thomas read the message over her shoulder, his expression darkening. "So it's not over." "No," Margaret agreed. "But it's different now. Victor's under surveillance, restricted travel, monitored communications. He can't move against us without violating bail conditions and spending the next decade in federal prison. Unless he doesn't care anymore, unless revenge matters more than freedom." It was a valid concern. They'd both known operatives who'd sacrificed everything for vengeance, who'd burned their lives down just to hurt the people who'd wronged them. Victor could be that kind of man. Margaret made a decision. "I'm going to talk to him." "Absolutely not. That's insane." "Is it? He's staying at a hotel in downtown Atlanta, probably with FBI agents in the next room. It's the safest place I could possibly confront him, and if I don't, this will hang over us forever. We'll spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for the other shoe to drop." Thomas was silent for a long moment, wrestling with logic and emotion. Finally, he nodded. "Together. We go together. Always." The flight to Atlanta took 90 minutes. The Uber ride to the Ritz-Carlton took 15. Victor was staying in a suite on the 20th floor, under house arrest with an ankle monitor and FBI surveillance. Margaret called ahead, using the same direct approach that had worked before. "Victor, this is Margaret. I'm downstairs. I'd like to speak with you. 5 minutes, that's all I ask." There was a long pause. "You're persistent, I'll give you that. Come up. The FBI agents will let you through." The agents were professional but skeptical, checking IDs, running background checks, finally allowing Margaret and Thomas to proceed under strict supervision. Victor's suite was luxurious but obviously felt like a cage. He stood by the window, looking out at the Atlanta skyline, looking older and more tired than he had a week ago. "You came to gloat?" Victor asked without turning around. "No," Margaret said quietly. "I came to apologize." That got his attention. He turned, surprise evident on his face. "Apologize? Not for stopping you in Berlin. That was the right thing to do, and I'd do it again. But for what happened after. We didn't intend for you to spend 5 years in prison. We testified that you were a mid-level operative following orders, not a mastermind. But politics intervened, examples were made, and you paid a price that was disproportionate to your actual crimes." Victor studied her for a long moment. "Why tell me this now?" "Because holding grudges is exhausting, because we're all too old for this, and because I genuinely believe you're capable of more than revenge. You built a successful business, created a new life. Don't throw it away for something that happened 30 years ago." "Easy for you to say. You weren't the one in Siberia." "No," Thomas interjected, "but we weren't free either. We spent 3 decades hiding, using assumed names, always looking over our shoulders. The Cold War ended, but we never stopped fighting it. That changes now, for all of us." Victor walked to a small bar, poured himself vodka, then surprised them by pouring 2 more glasses. He handed them to Margaret and Thomas. "In Russia, when enemies make peace, they drink together. Old tradition." Margaret accepted the glass cautiously. "Are we making peace? I'm considering it. Your apology, unexpected as it is, means something. And perhaps I have been living in the past too long." He raised his glass. "To the end of old wars." They drank together, the vodka burning warm and clean. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was a start, a fragile truce between people who'd spent too long being enemies. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked. "The trial could last years. I have excellent lawyers. I'll fight, probably lose on some charges, win on others. Eventually, I'll serve some time, get deported back to Russia. I've made my peace with that." He smiled wryly. "At least the prisons are better than they were in Soviet times." As they prepared to leave, Victor stopped them at the door. "For what it's worth, you were good, the best I ever faced. Berlin, I thought I was untouchable. You taught me humility. Painful lesson, but valuable." "You weren't bad yourself," Thomas admitted. "That network you built was impressive. Wrong purpose, but impressive nonetheless." They shook hands, 3 old warriors acknowledging mutual respect across decades of enmity. It wouldn't erase the past, but it allowed them to move forward without the weight of constant vigilance. The flight back to Charleston was quiet. Margaret and Thomas held hands, watching clouds drift past the window, both lost in thoughts of roads not taken and battles finally concluded. Their house in Charleston felt different now, not safer. They were too experienced to believe in safety, but settled, like a book whose final chapter had been written, allowing the covers to close properly. Margaret stood on the porch the next morning, tea in hand, watching the neighborhood wake up. Mrs. Henderson walked her dog. The mailman arrived precisely on time. The college student 3 houses down left for class. Ordinary life, the kind they'd fought to protect for so many years, now theirs to enjoy. Thomas joined her, his own tea steaming in the cool morning air. "What do you want to do with the rest of our retirement?" Margaret considered the question. "Garden, read, maybe travel without looking over our shoulders. Visit places we missed because we were too busy saving the world." Sounds boring. Sounds perfect. They stood together as the sun climbed higher. Two people who'd lived extraordinary lives now embracing the extraordinary gift of normalcy. The weapons in the basement would stay there, maintained but unused. The skills they'd honed would fade gradually, muscle memory giving way to the gentle decline of age. And that was okay. They'd earned their peace. 3 months later, Margaret received one final communication from Commander Rutherford. Victor had accepted a plea deal, 5 years in minimum security, followed by deportation. In exchange, he'd provided intelligence on Russian organized crime that would lead to dozens of arrests. Redemption, perhaps, or pragmatism. Either way, the threat was resolved. The Whitmores continued their quiet life in Charleston. They joined a book club, volunteered at a local library, became fixtures in their community. Sometimes, when the news showed international crises or intelligence failures, they'd exchange knowing looks, remembering when those were their problems to solve. But mostly they focused on the present, on friends, on hobbies, on each other. 5 years after the incident that had upended their retirement, Margaret and Thomas stood in their garden, surveying tomatoes that had grown remarkably well despite their neglect earlier in the season. Thomas had his arm around Margaret's waist, and she leaned into him with the comfort of decades together. "Do you ever miss it?" Thomas asked. "The missions, the adrenaline, the sense of purpose?" Margaret considered the question honestly. "Sometimes. But then, I remember why we did it. So people could live ordinary lives without fear. We earned the right to be ordinary too. We were never ordinary, love." "No," she agreed with a smile, "but we can pretend." And in that garden, in that quiet Charleston neighborhood, 2 legendary spies found something more valuable than any mission success or intelligence coup. They found home. Final appeal to audience. And that's where we leave Margaret and Thomas Whitmore, 2 extraordinary people who chose an ordinary life, proving that sometimes the greatest victory is simply surviving to enjoy the peace you fought to create. What did you think of their journey? Could you have forgiven an enemy like Victor? Could you have walked away from that life and found contentment in the simple things? We want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling us your thoughts on this story, and while you're at it, tell us your name and what city and state you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers from all over. If this story moved you, inspired you, or kept you on the edge of your seat, do us a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible story. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed this journey with the Whitmores, and share this video with anyone who appreciates tales of courage, redemption, and the power of letting go. The next video recommended on your screen is another story you absolutely cannot miss. It's already queued up and ready to captivate you all over again. Don't go anywhere. Stay with us for more unforgettable narratives. Thank you for being here, for investing your time in these characters, and for being part of our community. Until next time, remember, everyone has a story, and every story matters.